So in this talk, I want to share with you some thoughts about beauty as a necessity and not a luxury. So hopefully that title and that thesis, if you will become clearer as we go. Three main things I want to try to get across. First of all, I want to share my experience and how my experience in my life has verified for me that exposure to beautiful things, beautiful artifacts, beautiful works of art, for me have proven to be a necessity and not just a luxury. And then I want to kind of invoke some authoritative voices to show you that these aren't just my ideas. The church really shares this view, and in fact has a very beautiful and extensive understanding of the arts and the nature of the arts and the place of the arts in the life of believers and of society. And then finally, I'd like to end with some practical things which might be of help, hopefully to any of you, but especially those of you who are artists or who have some creative aspirations. So, start out with an anecdote. I was with a friend. We were at the Botanical Garden in St. Louis. Anyone been there? It's worth checking out sometime. I know Mary Beth, the Missourian, has been there. It's really awesome. So I was there with a friend, and it was June, and everything was in bloom, and amid the sights and the smells and the colors and the creatures and the sun and the architecture and just the sheer gratuity of the botanical diversity, I just felt happy to be alive. And I was just drinking it in. I turned to my friend and I said, how could we live without this? And his response was, we couldn't. And at the time, it just seemed like hyperbole. We were both kind of caught up in the beauty of the moment. But I've been thinking a lot about this little exchange, and upon reflection, I'm becoming certain more and more that these weren't just sentimental words. This wasn't just hyperbole, but this was actually the truth. And with this conviction, I'm not alone. Many of you know one of my heroes is Father Luigi Giussani. And Father Giussani is the founder of the Communion Liberation Movement. His writings, witness of his life, have been just a huge bright light. I could talk for hours just about how he's influenced me. But anyway, I want to share a few of his thoughts with you. So he was a 20th century priest, educator, and writer. His cause for canonization was actually just opened up. And I have a feeling he'll be on the fast track because one of his best friends was the guy who's currently the Pope. So hopefully Pope Benedict, may God grant him long life to be able to see at least the beatification of Father Giussani seen through. Anyway, throughout his life, Father Giussani insisted on the need for beauty, for beautiful, real things that have the power to awaken our hearts. So 2 months before Ratzinger was named Pope, he actually was chosen to give the funeral homily in Milan for Father Giussani. And it's a masterpiece. Even if you don't know anything about Father Giussani, the homily, and he did it all without notes. It was all just completely from his heart. But he said, among other things, he said, Father Giussani was wounded by the desire for beauty. He noted how much Father Giussani loved music, and he said that in looking for beauty itself, capital B, he was looking for Christ. He was looking for beauty itself, and in doing so, he was looking for Christ. Kind of touch more on that as we go. So in Giussani, we have an author whose books overflow with quotations from poets, novelists, and philosophers. We have a priest whose ministry to students often took place on hikes through the Alps. I guess that's what happens when you're from Tuscany. You have access to some beautiful places to take your students. And he was a teacher who raised the eyebrows of his colleagues. This was in the 50s, before the days of the iPod. He logged an actual phonograph into his classroom, play works by Beethoven and Chopin, etc., for his students. And his colleagues scratched their heads saying, isn't this guy supposed to be teaching religion? What's he doing playing this classical music for his students? Of course, we know what he was doing. He was trying to awaken their hearts through beauty. So Jesus said, you'll know them by their fruits. And by sharing his own wound for beauty with his students, Father Giussani has given us the fruits of many sanctified souls and a movement in the church, Communion and Liberation, that has moved hearts in now almost 100 countries. Father Giussani is not the only modern-day Catholic luminary to champion the cause of beauty. On Easter Sunday, 1999, Pope John Paul II issued his letter to artists. Let me just see a show of hands. How many of you knew that such a document existed? Okay, how many of you didn't know anything about it? Okay, most of you. Okay, it's one of these unknown treasures. You can read it in it's not that long. You probably read it. Well, if it was anybody else, you could read it in one sitting. Since it's JP2, he's kind of a tough read, so maybe two. Lengthwise, it's readable in one sitting. He issued his letter to artists. This profound document is actually not just for artists, it's for everyone. It offers a deep reflection, really, on the mystery of what it means to be human. And of our innate human need for beauty. So according to Blessed John Paul II, and here's some quotes, beauty offers a momentary glimpse of the vastness of light that has its original wellspring in God. The Pope says, every genuine art form in its own way is a path to the inmost reality of the human being and the world. It is therefore a wholly valid approach to the realm of faith, which gives human experience its ultimate meaning. Pretty profound claims, pretty deep stuff he's saying here. Pope goes on to give a brief historical sketch of the many ways the gospel has inspired what he calls epiphanies of beauty, which artists have shared with the church and with the world. And he speaks favorably of the enormously fruitful alliance between faith and art, and between the church and artists. And the letter has sections entitled, The Church Needs Art, as well as a chapter entitled, Does Art Need the Church? What do you think his answer was? It's a big, resounding yes. And he lays out his reasons for that. Many of you may or may not know that one of the perks that he enjoyed as Pope was he could call up awesome people from all over the world and say, hey, you want to come to the Vatican and hang out? And who wouldn't want to hang out with the Pope, right? So when he was in Rome and he wasn't traveling, he would regularly have lunches that would go on for 3 hours. And he would invite philosophers, artists, politicians, scientists, writers, just interesting people. And by no means were all these people Catholic. He just invited all these people that were just interesting people just to share about life and the deeper questions of life. He links true art with an authentic Christian humanism, saying, even beyond its typically religious expressions, true art has a close affinity with the world of faith, so that even in situations where culture and the church are far apart, like ours, art remains a kind of bridge to religious experience, insofar as it seeks the beautiful as the fruit of an imagination which rises above the everyday. Art is by its nature a kind of appeal to the mystery. So it's really interesting. Even in situations where the church and the culture are far apart, art is a kind of a bridge to religious experience. Now, it can also become a substitute for religious experience, and that can become a problem. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But he also said that in light of Vatican II, we need to build on the foundation laid there for a renewed relationship between the church and the culture. He says art is a privileged way of doing this. And then in his letter, he quotes Vatican II saying, listen to this, the world needs beauty in order not to sink into despair. Does that seem to ring true to you? Have any of you ever had an experience of something beautiful saving you from sinking into maybe not complete despair, but your heart was roused out of a darkened state because of something beautiful that broke through? The world needs beauty in order not to sink into despair. Beauty, like truth, brings joy to the human heart and is that precious fruit which resists the erosion of time, which unites generations and enables them to be one in admiration. And this is quoting from a talk given by the Council Fathers at the end of Vatican II. So, moving along from Pope John Paul II, we could marshal a whole bunch of other quotes from him. This is just from the letter to artists. I really encourage you to read it. You can just Google it and download it from the Vatican website, and I think you'd really enjoy it. Pope Benedict also shares his predecessor's views on the importance of art and beauty in the life of faith. As Cardinal Ratzinger, he made some comments along these lines, which are tremendously inspiring. And a message to members of Communion Liberation, which, as we said, was the movement founded by his good friend, Father Giussani. In 2002, he said, "Christian art today must oppose the cult of the ugly." The cult of the ugly. I think you guys see that, just the way the coarseness of our culture. We see it in maybe concentrated forms and things like, the excesses of post-industrial culture, blighted cities, et cetera, et cetera. But, I think on a lesser level, we see it playing out in so many ways. Terrible sitcoms on TV. I love good sitcoms, by the way. So I'm not just criticizing the vulgarities of television, but there's so much just junk out there, that's just so inhumane. So he talks about opposing the cult of the ugly. Christian art has to lead the charge. He spoke of the wound of beauty which inspires and provokes man with nostalgia for his transcendent destiny. He quotes Plato's Phaedrus, one of Plato's dialogues, and reflects this way. He says, "Plato contemplates the encounter with beauty as the salutary emotional shock that makes man leave his shell and sparks his enthusiasm by attracting him to what is other than himself. Man, says Plato, has lost the original perfection that was conceived for him. He is now perennially searching for the healing, primitive form. Nostalgia and longing impel him to pursue the quest. Beauty prevents him from being content with just daily life. Beauty causes him to suffer. In the Platonic sense, we could say that the arrow of nostalgia pierces man, wounds him, and in this way gives him wings, lifts him upwards toward the transcendent. The beautiful wounds, but this is exactly how it summons man to his final destiny." A lot packed in there. Have you ever had an experience where you heard a song or you saw something, let's say the sunset over the Grand Canyon, or even looked into the face of a beloved, and what you saw there was so beautiful that it hurt? And it's a kind of a blessed wound, because it's a wound that saves us from complacency. It's a wound that bids us to come out of our ego and to come into that, to heed the summons that beautiful work or that beautiful smile or that beautiful person has evoked in us. So we have a destiny, and this arrow of beauty pierces our heart, and it reawakens our nostalgia for that eternal destiny and gets us moving back towards it again. He describes an experience he had at a Bach concert he attended with his friend, a Lutheran bishop. And he says, "When the last note triumphantly faded away, we looked at each other spontaneously, and right then we said, 'Anyone who has heard this knows that the faith is true.' The music had such an extraordinary force of reality that we realized, no longer by deduction, but by the impact with our hearts, that it could not have originated from nothingness, but could only have come to be through the power of the truth that became real in the composer's inspiration. He is describing the way that beauty conquers nihilism and affirms reality, being, and truth. On a much less highbrow level, I had an experience like this. In 2009, I went with some friends and my brother to the U2 concert in Chicago, and 65,000 people at Soldier Field, and they had this unbelievable stage set up, including this beam of light that shot into the sky. You know those beams of light they had at the 9/11 memorial at the World Trade Centers? On a smaller scale, it was like that, and it shot up into the sky. And they did the song "City of Blinding Lights." Any U2 fans here? If you're familiar with that song. Anyway, check it out. It's a really powerful song. And the chorus is, "Oh, you look so beautiful tonight." And imagine 65,000 people, pumping their fists and singing this along with the chorus, "The City of Blinding Lights." And I don't have time to go into what the meaning behind the song is. It has to do with his father, his late father, and who he had a stormy relationship with. But what his father must look like when he went to glory. So anyway, it was really awesome. It was a feeling of these people are all strangers, but there's something in this music that's uniting us and pointing us to the beyond. Sometimes people say, well, rock music is, incapable of generating that type of response. And we all know there's very degraded forms of rock music. But at that moment, I said, I'm never, ever going to entertain the criticism from anybody again that rock music cannot be a path to the transcendent, because what I experienced at that concert was kind of similar to what the Pope seems to be describing with his classical music concert. Ratzinger is not just content in his talk to dwell on artistic beauty. He goes on to speak of the beauty of holiness and its power to convince a skeptical world weary of words. He says, I have often affirmed my conviction that the true apology of Christian faith, the most convincing demonstration of its truth against every denial, are the saints and the beauty that the faith has generated. Today, for faith to grow, we must lead ourselves and the persons we meet to encounter the saints and to enter into contact with the beautiful. If you've ever known a person who was a saint or who is well on their way towards sanctity, you know what it can provoke in our hearts. Just a higher possibility of life, a greater destiny awakens in us. A higher and truer kind of life kind of beckons us when we come into contact with somebody who truly has the love of Jesus in their heart. So, in his talk, Ratzinger also favorably quotes another luminary who I'd like to bring into this discussion, the great Swiss priest-theologian named Hans Urs von Balthasar. Anyone heard of him before? Awesome. Balthasar is amazing. He wrote voluminously, and so he's kind of intimidating for some people. It's like, where do you start? The guy was well-read in like 7 languages and just wrote on so many different topics. And he wasn't necessarily a linear thinker. I think in the next 100 years or so, I look forward to seeing people who can kind of, for want of a better word, popularize the profound insights of this amazing theologian and kind of get them out into the minds and hearts of the Catholic faithful and indeed everyone. But anyway, he quotes Balthasar, whose life's work was largely to do theology under the aspect of the third transcendental, namely beauty. So the ancient Greeks believed there were these transcendentals, the main 3 being the good, the true, and the beautiful. So Balthasar believed that beauty makes truth credible. and that something true and good will also somehow be beautiful. And he also believed that amid the damage done to the credibility of truth and goodness in recent history, beauty remains as perhaps the most hopeful path towards reawakening us to the glory of God and his divine revelation. So Balthasar was this man of immense learning and culture, a lover of literature and art and music as well as theology. And he incorporated all these elements into his writings, especially kind of his magnum opus, which is Theological Aesthetics, The Glory of the Lord. Actually, Theological Aesthetics is 1/3 of his work, The Glory of the Lord. It's like 7 massive volumes. I haven't read them all. Not even close, but Ratzinger notes with some apparent regret that while details from Balthasar's work have passed into theological work, his fundamental approach, which he says in truth is the essential element of the whole work, has not been so readily accepted. Balthasar used as one of his interpretive theological keys the biblical concept of glory, seen as the radiant, inherent beauty and love of God manifested gratuitously to man in Christ. If I had more time, I'd love to give some more insight into the profound thought of von Balthasar, but anyway, maybe for some other time. But Ratzinger and John Paul II, they also quote the famous line from Dostoevsky's The Idiot. Has anyone read that? Okay, which says, "Beauty will save the world." And so what they mean, along with Dostoevsky, is not some type of shallow aestheticism, but a beauty which is capable of truly wounding exhausted hearts by breaking through the thick clouds that darken so much of contemporary society, awakening or reawakening us to our original, infinite, transcendent dignity and destiny. The 20th century German Catholic philosopher Joseph Pieper, he wrote a marvelous little work called Leisure, the Basis of Culture. If you haven't had a chance to check that out, do get your hands on it sometime. It's not an easy read, but well worth it. And it's not that long. Anyway, he called it Piercing the Dome of the Workaday World. He was referring to it in terms of grasping philosophical truths, but I think it can readily be applied to the world of art. It helps pierce the dome of the workaday world, and it lets in some transcendent light from above, beckoning us again towards our destiny. So my experience of 40 years of life has been a convincing verification of all these things. I've seen it over and over and over again. Many of you know, because I've preached about it numerous times, one of the reasons why I'm a priest is because of a French novelist named Victor Hugo. At a very impressionable era in my life, it's between my sophomore and my junior year of college. It was a really heady time in my life. I had experienced just about a semester earlier that I had a soul and that I had a mind. I know that sounds like startling discovery, but I was still kind of high from this discovery. And through a series of circumstances, I ended up picking up Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. I read the whole book in like a week. It's like a massive, massive book, and I'm not that fast a reader. But there's this, many of you are familiar with the story. It's a convicted criminal in 1800s France who's arrested for stealing a loaf of bread. He ends up being thrown in the slammer. He tries escaping a number of times. His prison sentence ends up being 19 years. He comes out a shattered, bitter, and hateful man. And he has these yellow convict papers. No one will hire him. And so, as chance or providence would have it, he ends up knocking on the door of the bishop of the region, who he doesn't know as a bishop because the guy lives with extraordinary simplicity. He just thinks he's a poor country priest. Bishop takes him in, feeds him, calls him Monsieur, treats him with dignity and respect. And in the middle of the night, Valjean makes off with the one thing of value that's in the bishop's home, which is an heirloom set of silverware. And he's caught by the cops. He's brought back the next day. And to his utter astonishment, Valjean receives forgiveness from the bishop. He even says, "Here, you forgot the candlesticks. Take these with you, and remember, you promised that with the silver, you'll become an honest man." Anyway, the conversion scene is so powerful, and Victor Hugo spends about 80 to 100 pages just setting up the life of the bishop before we even have Valjean enter into the narrative. And I was so moved by this story, and I was so moved by this bishop. I was like, if this is what it is, then sign me up. Because the bishop, he sets in motion through the conversion of Valjean this string of events that just is unbelievably complex and beautiful, and it's all about people giving themselves up, dying so that others might live. And this one act of forgiveness by this holy bishop was the catalyst for all of it. And the bishop never knew it. He never knew what happened. Valjean went off into the night, and he never heard him or saw him again. But at a very young and impressionable age, the beautiful portrayal of this Christ-like figure in literature just captured my imagination and my heart to such a degree that it made me start really taking seriously what I felt was a budding call towards the priesthood. I could go on and on. I grew up in a very well intentioned and loving Catholic family, but it was almost like Catholic fundamentalism. My parents have since mellowed a lot, but it was kind of an extreme form of Catholic, like hardcore Catholicism. And for me, my refuge was learning how to play the guitar. And Bob Dylan. I know it sounds strange, but I would list Bob Dylan as probably one of the 3 to 5 most influential people in my life. The way that his lyrics and just the way that his songwriting just captured my heart as a youth. It was just like he was articulating things that nobody else was saying. So, and then of course there's Lord of the Rings, which I discovered later on in life, which has been another one. I remember when I was newly ordained priest, I came down with a really bad TMJ. You ever heard of that? It's a joint disorder in your jaw. And for most people, it gets better. They get fitted for a night guard and it goes away. But mine just kept getting worse and worse. Long story short, I suffered for more than a year. It was to the point where I was almost ready to take a leave of absence from ministry because I was in such terrible pain. And I wasn't sleeping. It was just a very, very hellish time of my life. And it was in that time that I was praying to God to just throw me a bone, give me some comfort, give me some consolation. And I picked up the recording of Yo-Yo Ma's unaccompanied cello suites from J.S. Bach. Have you heard that? It's probably my desert island recording. And then God directed me to the novels of Willa Cather. I don't know if any of you have read her. I went through my Willa Cather phase, and so there was like 2 or 3 months there where at night I'd just go into my room, I'd put on the Yo-Yo Ma plays Bach, and I would read my Willa Cather. And strange as it sounds, that was probably the chief grace that got me through the difficult times. Art, beauty, that in the midst of this physical suffering, it was like a reminder that there was a higher destiny for me, and that God wasn't through with me yet, and to keep hoping and keep persevering. So anyway, I could go more and more into my own verifications, but the point is this. Just when I'm about ready to throw in the towel, by throw in the towel, I don't mean I'm going to go drive my car off a cliff or something. But you know what I'm saying? We have moments where we just forget it. What's the point? I'm just going to settle. I'm just going to go along to get along. Why should I want so much out of this life? I'm just going to get disappointed. Just when I'm about to succumb to the sadness and living death, some piercing ray of beauty breaks my heart again, and the breath of possibility returns. A personal certainty confirms for me that the proposals of what these guys are saying is true. I'm not one of these guys that says, oh, Father Giussani said it, Pope John Paul II said it, Ratzinger said it, so therefore it must be true. I'm quoting these guys because I think they articulate it very well. But I'm quoting them, first of all, because they're articulating my own experience. And I think they're helping Catholics understand that this is normal, and this is an aspect of church teaching. You know, these aren't just these guys' opinions. These are luminaries in the church who are carriers of the tradition of the church's expertise in humanity, who are telling us, you know, we need this. Sometimes we think that, well, if I get all my work done, then I can treat myself to a little bit of beauty. But these giants of faith and humanity that we quoted are all saying basically the same thing. You know, we just quoted them. The wounding desire for beauty, the experience with works of art as a path to the inmost realities of the human and of the faith. The experience of art as a bridge to religious faith. Art is a privileged way towards a renewed relationship between faith and culture. Beauty is an antidote to despair and the cult of the ugly. The arrow of nostalgia that piercingly summons us to a transcendent destiny. And the demonstration of faith's truth through convincing artistic works. To me, these are all verified truths, articulated very well, which I'd like to share with you. Beauty will save the world. Well, that may remain to be seen. But I can say this, beauty has saved me and continues to do so. My experience is that I need saving frequently. Alas, all too frequently. My experience is that saving is not a luxury, it's a necessity, and beauty saves. Or maybe to put it more precisely, beauty awakens me and points me to the one who does save, beauty itself. Beauty is a necessity, not a luxury, because beauty moves us, it awakens us, it provokes us, and it brings freshness and newness when our hearts have grown old and stale. A luxury is something extra. A luxury is something we allow ourselves after our duties are complete. But beauty is not something extra. Beauty comes first. Beauty is what moves us in the first place to get our duties done. Without beauty, the duties prove too hard, and eventually they seem pointless. An old, tired soul can't move itself and can't sustain itself. It ultimately fails in its tasks. Beauty renews the soul, pointing us ever back to our origins and our destiny, and makes life begin again. And so we pray that God will never leave us bereft of anointed artists, prophets, and poets of the transcendent who will keep wounding our hearts with this nostalgia for the infinite destiny that alone matches the proportions of our heart. And I'd like to say a few other things here as we near the end. A couple practical matters. There's a wonderful book by an author named Andy Crouch. It's called Culture Making. Have any of you ever heard of this book? I would highly encourage you to check it out. It's really great. Andy Crouch is an evangelical author who has thought very deeply about the relationship between faith and culture. And so here's his basic thesis. He says Christians assume various attitudes towards culture. By culture, he means any artifacts made by hand. So we're talking literature, film, music, art, but also we're talking technology, architecture, etc. Anything that is an artifact made by human hands that ends up having a presence and an influence on people's lives. So he says Christians often assume usually one of three main stances, or a combination of them, towards culture. Number one is they're consumers. You know? And we all know this, right? We want the newest Apple product when it comes out. We want to go see the Avengers the night it comes out. We want to get the new Mumford & Sons record as soon as it comes out. And none of this is bad, okay? None of this is bad. We need to have good cultural artifacts deserve to have people that are consumers of it, because hopefully they make our lives better and happier. Of course, a lot of the stuff they put out is not worthy of our consumption. But anyway, so we consume it. We're reliable consumers of cultural artifacts that come our way. Or he says we see these cultural artifacts, and then we want to copy them. So like for example, you have like the Christian rock scene, the Christian music scene, where the same type of chord structures that are used in popular music are adopted, but we put Jesus lyrics over them, right? And kind of this whole subculture is created, and we're copying, but often it doesn't really ring true to people. And some of it's good, but it often doesn't ring true to people because it seems very derivative. You know what I mean? Oftentimes, he's saying Christian artists are the taillight, not the headlight. They're following the trends. They're not making the trends. Do you see what I'm saying? So we end up becoming, copycats. I remember there's a band called Megadeth. Okay, well, I remember one time I was at this Christian festival and there was a band called Mega Life. And it was just like, come on. Can't you come up with something a little bit more creative? Anyway, so there's consuming, there's copying, and then the third one is critiquing. And this is the whole, we go on these rants against the vulgarity of pop culture. And again, there's much to be ranted against. Don't get me wrong. But, when I grew up, I would hear it all the time. Like my parents did not like my choice of music. I wasn't even listening to anything that bad, but, well, why do you want to listen to Jimi Hendrix? The guy choked in his own vomit. It's like, well, that's true. That's definitely bad. But it doesn't mean that he couldn't play some pretty awesome guitar in the years when he wasn't choking on his vomit. Do you know what I'm saying? But there's certain people who assume a stance vis-a-vis the culture where it's like, no, we're Christian. Our concern is to get into heaven. Why do you need this? Why do you need to listen to secular music? Why do you need to go to movies? Why do you need to watch TV? Why are you watching football on Sundays? You could be spending that extra time praying. Look at all the bad things that are produced by our culture, and we critique them. And again, often not without merit. There's a lot of things in our culture which are vulgar and crass and inhumane and that are dragging us down, and they probably are worthy of some, even sometimes some sharp critique. So Andy Crouch is not saying that any of these three things in and of themselves are bad, but he says, when these are the only main stances that we take vis-a-vis the culture, and we're either consuming what they're offering, or we're copying it, creating stuff but derivatively, or we are critiquing it, what's not happening? The fourth big C word, creation. And he goes into this whole thing about how we are created in the image of a God who is a creator. The first words of the Bible are, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's all about God as a creator, right? Before God is seen as a trinity, before God is seen as love, before God is seen as truth, things which come later in the scriptures, he is revealed as a creator. We are created in his image. So we're in the image of a creating God. So he says Christians should be the headlight, not the taillight. We have an awesome creative God who should be inspiring us to make awesome creative works. And he gives this beautiful little anecdote. He says, me and my wife like to cook. And they have 2 children. At the time of the writing of the book, I believe they were like maybe ages 6 and 8, or 7 and 10, something like that. He says, and my wife and I love chili. And he goes into this beautiful little summary of how we make chili. We dice up the onions, we caramelize the onions, put a little garlic in there, we start to chop the tomatoes, put a few peppers in, and then we brown the meat, we start adding the sauce. And he says, we love chili, we probably have it once a week. It's an old family recipe. He says, the kids always complain. They said, chili again, we don't want to have chili. And he says, my wife and I, You know what we say? Tough. We decided when we got married that we were going to be the type of family that you eat what's on your plate, or you go to bed hungry. And so the kids, they eat it, but they eat it grudgingly. And he says, they can complain. They've kind of stopped complaining now because they know it's not going to get them anywhere. And he says, really, no amount of complaining is ever going to get them anywhere. But he says, there is one thing that my kids could do that could change the equation. He says, if my wife and I came home from work one day and we walked into the kitchen and we smelled food smells wafting from the kitchen, and we saw a cookbook open, and we saw our kids trying their hand at making something, it might not be very good because it might be the first time, but he says, I guarantee you we wouldn't have chili that night. we would eat what they offered, and he says in a way we Christians are like the kids. We're sitting there complaining about all the vulgarity in our culture, and about the bad books that are written and the bad movies that are out and the bad sitcoms and the bad music and blah 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 blah, and the technology that does all these things to our relationships. But he says the culture doesn't even really listen to us. We just sound like we're just annoying, critics. But he says if we produce something of real worth and value, they have to take notice. There was a readers poll done in the year 2000. It was among English-speaking readers. And do you know what book topped almost every single one of the readers polls? Anybody know? This is total 20th century, novel of the century. Guess which book it was? On like 8 out of the 10 major readers polls. Lord of the Rings by Tolkien. Guess what? Tolkien was a devout Catholic. And guess what? His Catholicism is in those books. Not explicitly, not in some heavy-handed way, but it got absorbed into the story. I don't know about you, but that makes me feel pretty proud that the author of the century was a Catholic. Think about the influence that he had. Now, you may or may not like The Lord of the Rings. You may or may not want to join in the chorus of people who always tease me about being such a Lord of the Rings geek. But the point is, the dude wrote an influential story. I mean, millions of people are talking about this, That's just one example. But the point is, he saw horrible things in his life. He was a veteran of the Battle of the Somme, which was the most horrible battle of all of World War I. 2 of his best friends died. He himself almost died. He got trench fever. He had to get shipped out before he died himself in the trenches. He saw the ugly industrialization of his beloved English countryside. He lived through that and all this. What did he do? He didn't just sit there and criticize it. He said, I'm going to use my creativity to create a story that will help people see it in a little different way. Now, granted, this was a man with great talent. We don't all have this talent. He's a once-in-a-generation, once-a-century talent. But, a lesser degree, why aren't more Christians and Catholics doing what he did? And then that leads me to my final point, which is something that harkens back to St. Thomas. And it's this. Art is a virtue. Have you ever heard that before? Art is a virtue. There's a little book by Jacques Maritain. He is a French philosopher of the 20th century who his main contribution was that he took St. Thomas Aquinas' writings and kind of translated it into a way that contemporary people could understand. So he addressed contemporary social issues, contemporary philosophical issues, bringing the wisdom of St. Thomas Aquinas to bear in a language that modern people can understand. Anyway, he wrote a book called Art and Scholasticism. If you're into the arts and creation, I highly recommend it. It's a little book, it's only like 120 pages long. And in it, he kind of revives, brings back into light this doctrine of St. Thomas, which has long been forgotten, which is that art is a virtue. So, what does this mean? Well, a virtue is an acquired habit of choosing rightly. Okay, so like prudence is the acquired habit of acting rightly when it comes to human behavior. Justice is the acquired habit of giving each one his due. Temperance is the acquired habit of moderating our desire for food, drink, and sexual pleasure so that we don't go overboard, so that we use these things in a way that are conducive to our common good and not in a way which becomes selfish or degrading to ourselves or unhealthy. Fortitude is the acquired habit of acting rightly, even in the midst of difficult circumstances. We have the strength and the backbone and the bravery to stand tall. Well, art is a virtue, but it's a little different kind of virtue. It's a virtue that doesn't involve things to be done. It's a virtue that involves things to be made. And so here's where it gets a little tricky. So he says the virtue of art is a very, very different type of virtue. Because in a way, it's kind of on a separate level than the moral virtues. It's very possible to be well skilled in the moral virtues, to be a just person, a temperate person, a prudent person, to have fortitude, but not have the virtue of art. And similarly, you can be an amazing artist and not have the other virtues. You see, art is basically, that virtue is dictated by the laws that govern the particular art. So if I'm a carpenter, if I have the virtue of art, which, by the way, I think it's safe to say Jesus had the virtue of art. You think Jesus was a good carpenter? You think his tables were square? You think his lines were square? You think Jesus put together shoddy stuff? Pretty sure he didn't. So the carpenter has the virtue of art if, the floors and the walls and the tables and the chairs that they build are well built. There's certain laws, right, that go into creating a good, square, solid table. And it takes a while to acquire that, right? Even a skilled person who's gifted with a lot of talent has to serve as an apprentice for a while to learn these skills to make a good table. I can be, a person who prays 6 hours a day and never commits any sin. That doesn't mean I'm going to make a good table. You see what I'm saying? It doesn't exempt me from having to take the time. If I'm going to be a carpenter, I got to learn how to make a table. And all my other virtues that I've acquired, it definitely will help me to be able to make a good table if I'm not stoned or drunk. But I need to have that virtue. So you bring that to bear on some of these other things. So getting back to my example of Tolkien, he had the virtue of art. The guy practiced his writing over and over and over again. He studied ancient literature, at a very high level. He learned the craft of good storytelling. And he even met together with his other literary friends regularly. They would read each other their work and they would critique it to get better. Okay? A masterpiece like The Lord of the Rings doesn't just appear overnight. It took him 17 years to write it. Mozart. Mozart was a child prodigy. He started writing pieces when he was like 5. But even Mozart didn't start writing really good pieces till he was about 9. But those 4 years were needed for him to acquire the virtue of art. So hopefully you kind of get what I'm saying. So here's the problem. Problem is we have a lot of secular people who've really, really acquired the virtue of art. But they don't have a Christian worldview. They don't understand the human person. They're really good. Have you ever had this? This happens to me all the time because I'm really big into music. There's bands that I absolutely love. Their music is so compelling. It's fresh, it's original, it's well produced, it's really powerful, but the lyrics are just, you know what I'm saying? Nothing there. At best, it's neutral, and at worst, it's filled with all kinds of just nihilistic goofiness. Or you listen to a really inspiring Christian song, and it's like, wow, these words are awesome, but the music is really kind of bad and cliched. You know what I'm saying? One of the areas, what we really need is we need people who are Christian, who have the other virtues and have the Christian worldview, and who know this kind of stuff that we've been talking about, but who have also acquired the virtue of art. And frankly, a lot of Christians just have been too lazy to do that. Or they've written it off. They've written off the world. They're waiting for the second coming. They say, this world sucks. It's in the hands of the devil. It's going to hell in a handbasket. Why should I even bother? I'm not going to write a beautiful story. No one's going to publish it. No one wants that stuff. Well, yeah, they do. But, are you sure they're not publishing your story just because you're a Christian? Or are they not publishing your story because it's poorly written? A good example of this is Mel Gibson's film, The Passion. You guys see that? Came out in 2004. Most people agree that it's a pretty high piece of art. Some people don't like it because it's really violent, but it's really a powerful artistic statement, And part of the reason why is because Mel Gibson, for all of his other problems, which came out later, but he had acquired the virtue of art, right? The guy had been in Hollywood long enough to be able to know how to make a good movie. Even his harshest critics say the guy knows how to direct a movie. But it took him years to get there. And he also had been through the rough stuff and addictions, etc., to the point where he had internalized his Christianity. Now, I don't know what's happened to him since. The wheels seem to have fallen off the cart, and we pray for his conversion or whatever. But there was a time there, around the time he was making this movie, where he was firing on all cylinders, seemingly, as a Christian and as an artist. And look what was produced. So really what we need artists who can learn the virtue of art. Flannery O'Connor was a great Catholic novelist who's still read in literature departments today. She's a very well-respected American novelist. And her Southern Gothic style takes a little getting used to. It's not for everybody. But, Flannery O'Connor talked a lot about this. She wrote a book called Mystery and Manners, which if you're a budding artist or a budding writer, strongly suggest reading. It's filled with powerful insights along the lines of what we've been talking about. But she was saying, she went to writers' workshops for years. Her first novel, Wise Blood, she started writing it when she was like 19, and it got published when she was 26. She kept reworking it, submitting it to other people, letting them look at it, hearing their criticisms, reworking it, reading the great novelists of her time. That's another thing we have to be willing to do if we're going to be artists. If you're going to be a great filmmaker, you got to watch the great films. You can't just say, well, I'm going to take the story of the gospel, I'm going to make a movie about it. You kind of have to study, well, what is it that makes, what are the hallmarks of the genre that make for a good movie? And then follow those principles. If you're going to be a musician, you can't just strum a few chords and then stick Jesus lyrics on it and expect that the whole world's going to be changed, You have to go back and listen to the great songwriters of the tradition and learn from them. And sometimes that means listening to artists who aren't Christian and whose message is not necessarily Christian, to learn what is the good that they've got. Filter out the bad, but to learn from the good. So anyway, it could go on and on, but the point is making a case here for the virtue of art. If we have that, then we can do what Andy Crouch said. If we don't like the chili that the culture is serving, we can begin making our own meals, and hopefully make meals that are so good that the culture has to take notice. So that's really the hope, is that we'll see a new generation, an anointed generation of poets and artists and writers and people of, even business people who can create technological artifacts that contain, the Christian worldview kind of embedded within them, absorbed within them. So the last thing I'm going to close here with is a little passage from The Hobbit by Tolkien. Unless you've been living under a rock, you know that in a couple months, the first Hobbit movie's coming out. I don't know if you're like me, you're eagerly anticipating it. And if you've seen the trailers, there was a trailer that came out a few months ago, and it's, if you've read The Hobbit, you know what I'm talking about. It's the scene where they're in Bilbo's dining room, and all the dwarves come in, and And then Bilbo can't decide whether he's going to go on the journey with them. And then all of a sudden, Thorin Oakenshield, the leader of the dwarves, he begins singing a song. Remember that? And there's a trailer that has that song. He's slowly singing the song. And it's really awesome. It just kind of got me revved up to go and see the movie. What happens in the book is Gandalf brings all these dwarves to Bilbo's house because he's got his reasons. He knows that Bilbo needs to go on this adventure. But Bilbo is a middle-aged hobbit who's very happy living in the comfort of his hobbit hole. He doesn't like adventures. He likes warmth. He likes many good meals a day. He likes to live kind of a comfortable life. But there's a little side of him, the Took side that he got from his mom, that is longing for an adventure. So all kinds of means are used to try and persuade him. Oh, come on, we're gonna go reclaim the treasure that Smaug the dragon stole from us. He's like, yeah, okay, it's not my treasure. Why should I worry about it? Or, they even appeal to his pride. Well, what are you, some type of a wuss, And he's kind of like, well, yeah, I am. What's wrong with that? So all these different appeals are kind of failing, but then it says that it says the room got dark, the fire died down, and the dwarves began to sing. And they sing this song, and it's all about, for over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day, to seek the pale enchanted gold, etc., etc. Now listen to this. As they sang, the hobbit felt the love of beautiful things made by hands, and by cunning and by magic moving through him, a fierce and a jealous love, the desire of the hearts of dwarves. Then something Tookish woke up inside him, and he wished to go and see the great mountains, and hear the pine trees and the waterfalls, and explore the caves, and wear a sword instead of a walking stick. He looked out the window, and that moves him to go. So, if you permit my little analogy here, you guys are the generation in which the dragon has stolen your inheritance. And it's time to get it back. And what is going to awaken our hearts to leave our comforts and go on the journey? It could be a dwarvish song, we need the song that will break through our objections and lead us out of our comfortable little hole to go on the adventure and to awaken our thirst for justice, to take back what's ours, and to face the evils of our day, to believe that there is hope still for the triumph. A good song, a beautiful piece of music, a beautiful piece of art can do just that. It can sound the summons. So may we always hear it, and may God give us the grace to follow where it leads.